Hi, and thank you so much for popping by. My name is Dr. Bita Pobaluzwi, and you're most welcome to this conversation today. This week, there's been a lot of discussion around the concept of economic diplomacy and therefore globalization. This because Botswana is set to open an embassy in Russia, the first ever embassy that Botswana has opened in Russia, specifically in Moscow. On the other hand, Russia has had an embassy in Gaborone for many years. However, if you look at this idea of accessing global markets, penetrating global markets, having a presence in Russia or representation in Russia will help Botswana to increase its engagement, to increase its reach and scope within that particular market. Now, through social media comments, there are members of the public who believe that Botswana is vulnerable to this specific partnership due to the current downturn in diamond sales. That perhaps this move is being triggered by the urgency for Botswana to diversify its economy and reduce its dependency on diamonds. And honestly, they are somewhat correct in this thinking because the definition of economic diplomacy is actually centered around helping nations or countries to recover from financial crises. In other words, this explains why Botswana is actively seeking another home for its diamonds. An article I was reading explains that, and I quote directly, economic diplomacy includes building international coalitions to help countries recover from financial crises. It entails convincing host government leaders to apply the policies and measures most likely to strengthen their economies and provide jobs for their people, even if the reforms have political costs. Of course, as a strategic communication person, the words that caught my attention specifically in this context are even if the reforms have political costs. If you look at Botswana's context, there's been a public health crisis, and this speaks to issues of corruption, high youth unemployment, low diamond sales. If you add these factors together and juxtapose them to the definition of economic diplomacy, you can see why Botswana is taking this untypical route. Also, considering that historically, Botswana has predominantly aligned itself with the West, which is why perhaps some members of the public are feeling a sense of uncertainty about this growing partnership with Russia. Now, there is nothing wrong with change in this regard, right? There is nothing wrong with change. However, I think what is missing based on this uncertainty from public comments is that perhaps the government of Botswana is not engaging the public enough and explaining why this is happening specifically right now when Russia is engaged with the war in Ukraine, right? So they are perhaps perceiving Russia as not the most appropriate partner considering the mood of the day. Now, like I'm saying, nothing wrong with change, but I think there could perhaps be more engagement with the public to explain a little bit more about what is going on and why it is going on. Now, if you look at this idea of Africa and Russia, the backstory here is that Russia, similar to the strategy of the Gulf states, has recently been deliberate and intentional about getting Africa into its domain. If you look at the history of Africa and Russia, countries such as Ethiopia and Egypt have had strong and official relations with Russia since the 1940s. And there are numerous other countries in Southern Africa, which is Botswana's neck of the woods, that have had, working relations with Russia and embassies or representation in that country, such as Namibia, South Africa, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So, in other words, Botswana has been seemingly left behind in this regional trend. I was just reading an article on Reuters, And this article is explaining that Dr. Penyo Butali, the Minister of International Relations or the Foreign Minister in Botswana, is describing the country as the best place for investment, considering its political and economic stability. Therefore, we strongly encourage Russian investors to come to Botswana, and that is a direct quote. Now, the terminology of Botswana as a politically and economically stable destination for investment aligns with the concept of economic diplomacy. And this is why, in the case of Africa, which is typically viewed as undemocratic, nations such as Botswana and Ghana are able to leverage on being democratic nations. Therefore, they can sell their peace, they can sell their stability, they can sell their adherence to the rule of law to potential business partners in global markets, business people who are looking for good returns on their investments. What I like about this idea of economic diplomacy and what is interesting about this idea of economic diplomacy is that it doesn't only benefit Botswana on a governmental level, it also benefits Botswana on the more business level within the country. So, Business Botswana, for example, a local private sector organization, last year paid a visit to the Minister of International Relations. And one of the requests that they were making is that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of International Relations should share their schedule for envoys. This will enable the private sector businesses to participate in some of these diplomatic missions, right? So Business Botswana is arguing that, if we have a schedule of these envoys that the ministry will be engaged in, it will help private sector businesses to also participate in these meetings, these negotiations, these discussions, or even potentially other trade related activities. In other words, economic diplomacy doesn't just benefit Botswana on a governmental level. However, the question is, what are the visible and invisible costs that will be associated with this growing and developing Russian partnership? As I also wondered with the potential partnership between Botswana and the Gulf states, specifically the UAE. Alrighty, my friend, I thank you so much for popping by. I hope you are having a lovely day where you are, but most importantly, I hope you're having a healthy day wherever you're watching me from. Bye.